To test my multiplayer framework, I decided to create an arena shooter. Here's what I did. I started by creating a lightweight rendering pipeline project, and then I imported the Google VR SDK. I'm making this project for Google Cardboard as I want to make a game that I can play with my brothers, and I don't have multiple high-end VR headsets. After that, I start working on the first-person controller. I want to separate the inputs and the controllers, so that if I want to use a different input method, I can do that down the line. The controller is very simple. It takes an input vector and it projects it onto a plane. Then it moves the player accordingly, plus it adds gravity. After setting up the controller and testing it out, everything seemed fine, so it's time to add some flair. I bought an asset with a toy revolver, arms and animations, and I made a couple of classes to handle the position and alignment of the revolver. The position is pretty straightforward. It just linearly interpolates to the target position, plus an offset in a specified amount of seconds. The rotation will spherically interpolate with the camera alignment. This is to add some difficulty to the shooting. You'll have to take extra care of the delay when aiming. As you can see, it took some tweaking to have the system working as I wanted it to feel, but it was really worth it in the end. I then added the firing to the input processor and started working on animations. This can be a tedious process and quite long as well, but again it is also well worth it in the end. Once the animations are done, I try to make sure that the triggers are called at the right time and that the flags for firing and reloading are set appropriately at the end of the relative animations. I'm using animation events to handle this. They're pretty handy, so check them out. After that was done, I started working on a system of hittable/hitter combo. The hitter will raycast against hittables, then an event system takes care of what happens on damage and on death. This will come in handy later when I add multiplayer functionality. It's now time for grappling hooks. I went with a spring joint setup here. You'll find plenty of good tutorials online for it. Added a line renderer and then set up the changes between character controller and rigid body. I have to say that I now regret this choice, as the end results are not what I wanted them to be, but the system works well enough for me to be satisfied for now. Some tweaking is required here as well, there's no escape from that. It works well enough though, it's time to move to the next step. And the next step is to integrate the Swiss Army server. I modified parts of the source code to make it work with customizable IPs, in the sense that I added a static class that will keep track of the server address, and that variable will be set at runtime before starting the connections. I made a setup scene where the IP address is configured, a logging scene where you can register an account and then, log in, and finally a lobby scene where players can brawl while they're waiting for the game to start after everybody is connected. After that, I focused on the player character for sending and receiving data. This is achieved through the use of the Net Synchronizer class, sending data if the entity is local, and receiving if it's not. In here, I also made sure to set up the SAS server to have it as a network prefab, and have the player prefab itself enable or disable components depending on whether it is a local or an online player. I also created a class to set up the game. This class will change room when the server establishes a connection and will spawn the player when the room has registered the change. At this point, I realized that some colors were needed, so I did a bit of customizing some aspects of the player. It was now time to handle the shooting, but before I could move into that, I realized that I needed a way to set the player to a starting position when they would die. So I set up a system of spawn points, and set the player to spawn at the one corresponding to the order in which they joined the room on the server. I wrapped it all nicely in a method I could call from the Online Player Manager class. For the shooting, I used the NetRPC class as I intended to send a message only when the local player manages to hit an online player. I then made sure that the shooting player would notify all other players in the room if he shot another player, and that player would take care of handling what happens when the shot is registered. I had to modify the hittable class to integrate this change, but it wasn't hard to do so. But after I thought everything was working fine, I ended up encountering a few issues with the remote procedure calls, until I realized that the reason for it was that I was disabling the game object that had the RPC code on it. Not my brightest moment, but mistakes happen all the time. Obviously, I forgot to set up the spawn points, so I did that. I then set up the game for Android deployment, again not too fun, but a necessary step. I decided that jumping and swinging was not enough, so I created a system to boost the player if they jump up when in the air. This took me a while because I was not getting the right results when checking from the character controller to be grounded. I solved it by applying gravity all the time. Not a difficult fix, but again, very necessary, and not an easy one to spot. I did some testing and tweaked some variables until I was happy with the results. A longer tweaking session ensued, alongside the ironing out of all the bugs I could find and some tests with connected phones. Finally, I went to Blender to model the arena. I unfortunately forgot to record the making of it, but it didn't take long, it's just a few basic shapes. Here it is anyways. I tried making it interesting, but you can tell I am no artist. Finally, I changed some colors and went to test the game out. Here it is in all its glory. Thanks for watching.